Hello, everyone. Welcome back once again. This is episode 9 of This Is Who We Are. My name is Steve Greenfield, and I thank you for joining. Today, I will be continuing for the second and concluding hour of the topic I introduced in episode 8, which is war. And specifically, how is it possible that a country like ours, with thousands of miles of ocean on either side of it and extremely friendly allies to the north and the south, would be spending, in the neighborhood of two-thirds of its discretionary federal budget on war? And in so doing and simultaneously sacrificing so much of our own hard-earned income, so much of our civil liberties, and so much of what we could be doing in the public sector to support the social contract and the general welfare, as the preamble to the Constitution outlines, in order to finance this massive, 2.5 war global military that we do, and how much that we sacrifice in order to keep that going. And again, this being the central theme here, that this is the one area of public policy in which our two major competing political institutions tend to completely agree and manage to bring along the entirety of their respective voting populations along with them. That's the critical element here. Why is it that war, that international war, specifically non-defensive war, wars initiated by us, not for defensive purposes, is chewing up so much of our consciousness, so much of our budget, so much of our productive capacity, and exacting from us so much personal and public sacrifice? How is it possible that this is the one area where our two institutions, which seem to agree on almost nothing, generally find universal agreement? And then the second part is key. How is it possible that they bring all of us along for the ride? Why is a liberal as likely to support invading Iraq as a conservative, even though there's no threat, to the United States coming from that arena? How is that consent manufactured? How is that consistently the one thing that that these antagonistic and hostile voting populations will consistently join together to do, even though ultimately we are the ones making all the sacrifices, not just in our income taxes and the money that's taken from us to make this happen, and the things that money could have bought that were given up to make that happen, but literally personal sacrifice, right? Soldiers, sailors, Air Force, we're talking about living people here who give up their lives, who give up their limbs, who, if they manage to come home alive, are often needed to be taken care of by family members for the rest of their lives because of the physical condition that they're in, the damage that they suffered physically, psychologically, in the course of carrying out these wars that are, again, non-defensive wars. How is it possible that this is the one area where the two major political institutions consistently agree and consistently bring the rest of us along for the ride, when otherwise we're generally convinced that we hate each other and agree on nothing, at least as far as domestic elements are concerned? And so, to get the thing started here, last time I finished off, I was talking about, I introduced the idea of the actual economic function of war in a country like ours, in a country as wealthy as ours, which is a combination of securing resources, denying them to potential economic competitors, and destroying massive amounts of surplus productive capacity. And why would we want to destroy that? I'm going to get back to that again, because we need to really grasp that. But I'm going to start out reading a couple of quotes from a couple of people who really knew their share about war, about defensive war, non-defensive war, wars of initiation, wars of conquest, what it does to a society, how it works, how you make it work, and how you drag the people to come along with it. The first one is going to be the infamous Nazi Hermann Göring, one of the top Nazi officials, arguably the second most powerful Nazi official after Hitler himself in Germany, and certainly the mastermind of much of the war effort and preparation for war and the launching of World War II and the conduct of World War II. And then when I get finished with Göring and the implications of what he has to say in the modern American world, I'm going to return to James Madison, one of the writers of the Constitution, one of the designers of our separation of powers, the principal author of the Bill of Rights. And, so someone who's certainly across all political boundaries in America, and in particular among conservatives who tend to practically fetishize the founders and the founding documents of this country and believe that, that those documents should be interpreted by their letter, by their original intent, and this is, again, remember what my purpose is here. I'm here to show people that we have plenty of common ground, and that this is an area in particular where conservatives and liberals alike, and everyone from the far left to the far right to everybody in the middle, would really be able to find common ground if we could get back to those basics of what it is that we think we understand about the meaning of being an American, the meaning of America in the world, what our revolution and establishment of country represented that made it fundamentally different from the European civilizations that gave birth to at least the white portion, the original powerful white portion, white Christian portion of how America was founded. We've gone into the other elements, the genocides, the slavery and stuff in previous episodes. But here, I want to talk about James Madison and what he had to say about the issue about why the constitutional separation of powers, about the raising of armies and the waging of wars and the declaration of wars was established. And it was not simply to limit executive power. So I'm going to start with Hermann Göring, the initiator of the last great multinational, act of conquest that we saw in the history of the world that ended with the onset of the nuclear age and some of the worst human rights violations in the history of all of warfare and all of civilization. And how simple he's able to bring this to our consciousness. And then we're going to go back, as I said, to the founding principles of the United States as articulated by James Madison, who wrote these principles and helped them get adopted in the 13 colonies as the buy-in of why people would agree to have a country in the first place, and then later became the commander-in-chief when he became president of the United States. So let's switch over for a second. Let's start with Göring, because I think that we'll all grasp this and maybe even find it kind of chilling and recognize something about ourselves and all of the undeclared wars that we've had throughout the world, going back to the end of World War II and the start of the Cold War. So here it is, Hermann Göring, infamous Nazi leader. He was being interviewed in prison in Nuremberg while awaiting his trial. So this quote is going to include a question that was posed to him in the middle of his statement, which was, asking about why people would go along with war. And so here's what he said. Why, of course the people don't want war. Why would some poor slob on a farm want to risk his life in a war when the best that he can get out of it is to come back to his farm in one piece? Naturally, the common people don't want war, neither in Russia, nor in England, nor in America, nor, for that matter, in Germany. That is understood. But, after all, it is the leaders of the country who determine the policy, and it is always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it is a democracy or a fascist dictatorship or a parliament or a communist dictatorship. The interviewer then interjected, there is one difference. In a democracy, the people have some say in the matter through their elected representatives, and in the United States, only Congress can declare wars. I'm going to pause here. This is fascinating, right? As of World War II, it was still generally accepted. The era of the undeclared war had not yet begun. So this was the Madisonian approach was still the generally accepted consciousness of American people when contemplating war. So he said again, in the United States, only Congress can declare wars. And to this, Göring said, oh, that is all well and good, but voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them they are being attacked and denounce the pacifists for a lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same way in any country. Okay, that is Hermann Göring, infamous Nazi leader. explaining how it was so simple to get the German people to rally behind the idea of invading other countries when it was only their powerful people who would benefit and only the common people who would do the dying. And as he said, that the best they could hope for was to come home in one piece to the original economic condition that they had been in themselves. Clearly, no benefit to themselves going out to do this. Surely we saw that in the United States. Perfect recent examples, the invasion of Iraq, right? We were ginned up to that. Joe Biden went out with Henry Hyde, the Republican, in late September of 2001, long before Bush started talking about invading Iraq. One Democrat, one Republican went on Meet the Press and started talking about how we would eventually need to invade Iraq and overthrow Saddam Hussein, raising those fears of supporting terrorism and weapons of mass destruction long before Bush and Cheney came out to start making that case, right? And that is exactly what Göring was talking about, right? There was grave danger. Weapons of mass destruction, we knew that they existed. They were created. It was only a matter of them being deployed. We have to stop them over there so that we don't have to eventually stop them over here. All of that ginning up of fear, anybody who would argue against it, denounced as being unpatriotic, denounced as raising danger to the American people. And of course, we saw over time, it was very swift to find out that it had all been made up, that there were no dangers present in Iraq, no dangers by the continued domination of that country by Saddam Hussein, admittedly a military dictator. And then we, continued waging that war anyway, tried to start nation building. We turned over their oil companies to British and American companies, their oil fields, just as expected. There's obviously a simple war of conquest for resources, and life kind of just has gone on here in America. This hasn't even been on the news in over a decade. And yet over there in Iraq, people are still occupied by a foreign power that invaded them and set up a puppet government. They are still not in control of their own economy, their own sovereignty, their own destiny. And, we will be staying there essentially forever, because there is no way that a government that's seen as collaborating with a foreign invader will ever enjoy legitimacy from the people and will ever reach a time when its people are not actively resisting it. But here in the United States, because we don't like to view ourselves as a warlike people, as conquerors, we've developed a second element to this, which was also interestingly used by Nazi Germany, but of course, because they were, of course, founded, as was Mussolini's fascism in Italy, expressly to stop the spread of communism. That our obsession from the start of the Cold War until the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s was that our wars were humanitarian, that we would be protecting the countries that we were invading from communist domination, becoming part of the Soviet bloc, and then somehow that would eventually build strength towards an eventual existential crisis for the United States. And that, of course, over time then turned after the fall of the Soviet Union, since we had installed military dictators, including Saddam Hussein, all over the world, including Manuel Noriega. We started a new way of explaining this to our people, which is that we were then liberating people from military dictators, from the tyranny of ruthless military dictators, who were to a large degree installed by the United States during the phase of this operation when we were supposedly protecting all these people from the dangers of communism and the perils of possibly being overthrown. This goes back, a perfect example, the United States overthrow of a properly democratically elected parliamentary government in the early 1950s in Iran, where the prime minister elected was a man by the name of Mossadegh, who definitely had socialist inclinations and wanted to see the oil wealth of Iran go to the benefit of the people of Iran. And so we sent our CIA in and we engineered a coup in there and overthrew him and installed what was supposed to be antithetical to the entire American experiment, the reason that we founded ourselves, right? Monarchy. We found some bloodline of an ancient royal family. The Shah of Iran was installed and became a ruthless military dictator, and he made sure that the oil wells would be available to be pumped and exploited by British and American oil companies. And then we saw what happened in 1979 when the Iranians themselves had finally had enough of that. And look where they are now. And we continue in this state of hostility, right? And so this is another part of the process, right? Now we claim that we need to go into Iran and liberate them from a ruthless theocracy, from a ruthless religious regime that is ruling their lives. And we can bring Western democracy to them and freedom to them and freedom to women. I don't know how many, we probably have to kill about 500,000 women to bring the rest of the women freedom as we tend to perceive it. But again, we are selling these wars now on humanitarian grounds. Right, that's how we promote it, because that makes the liberals feel good. Right, we're helping people. We're not hurting. When by the point you've killed 500,000, 1 million innocent people, wounded several million others, permanently disabled them, there has to come a point where we start to wonder to ourselves, what kind of help, did we deliver? By what definition of help is this help? So let's pause right now. We're just past the quarter-hour mark for kind of a program ID. This is a public affairs program online called This Is Who We Are, the emphasis on is. And, from what I was just explaining, that adds a new dimension for how we understand, who we think we are versus who we actually are. My name is Steve Greenfield, and I thank you for listening. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel, share this content with your friends. Maybe we can actually, bring about some kind of change. Maybe we don't need to have this happening anymore. And this really matters when we talk about helping other countries. Right now, we're staging an invasion of Venezuela, another oil country, here in the Western Hemisphere. Supposedly on the grounds that their dictator, their socialist government, which is actually an elected government and not a dictatorship, although it does have a strong executive, that they're starving. We've seen pictures that they supposedly have no food on the shelves of their supermarkets, and that their government is denying them food, that it's not about socialism, that it's not about overthrowing a country, it's not about conquering their oil, it's about they're starving, and we need to overthrow their government, which is preventing them from getting food, and we will bring them food, I guess out of the bays of our bombers after we overthrow their country and re-privatize their oil industry, because that's, what would have to happen in order to make food available, right? And yet, we know here in the United States what starvation looks like, right? I mean, we remember We Are the World, right? We remember Somalia, Ethiopia, Biafra, Bangladesh, going all the way back into my childhood, Bangladesh, and the George Harrison concert, and the War of Independence between Biafra and Nigeria, and the mass starvation. Some of us who are a certain age and used to watch television late at night might remember Sally Struthers crying out in places where children were starving and asking us to donate money to some religious charity that supposedly was providing food aid. And we know what starvation looks like. Right? It looks like little small children with grossly distended bellies and skeletal frames and big hollow eye sockets, right? We know what actual starvation looks like. Starvation does not look like you just walked into, Stop and Shop and saw empty shelves. A place that's starving doesn't even have a Stop and Shop. And yet those were the photos that they were showing us to convince us that we'll be helping the Venezuelans stop being denied the basics like food, that their dictator is denying to them, and the evils of socialism. Again, a benevolent act on our part if we were to invade this country, kill thousands, hundreds of thousands, maim people, destroy infrastructure in so doing, that this somehow is convincing and makes sense to us as a people. And yet here in the United States, we have over 50 million people that are living in poverty. 2/3 of them are children. They do not have food. The pandemic has exacerbated this. We have bread lines all over the country, right? There's food lines all over the country where people wait all day long to get their basic sustenance right now. That's been going on for a solid year. For the first 2-3 weeks, some of the news agencies were showing us those lines. But, there's been no more work. The pandemic is ongoing. Another few 100,000 people have died. None of these people have left the bread lines. Why do we have money supposedly to solve hunger in Venezuela, and to stop their government from supposedly denying them food and health care, when we in our country are denying our own people food and health care on a scale that exceeds the entire population of the entire nation of Venezuela. You know, how could that be happening? How could we still be falling for that? Well, that's why I read Hermann Göring, right? What the leaders do to get everybody to come along for the ride on this and to continue making the sacrifices that we make and even the basic sustenance that we're denying to our own people in order to maintain this global constabulary force and keep it fighting all over the world, every day of the year in more countries than any of us can even count right now, is because we are easily convinced that these are sacrifices we make to be good people, to help the hungry people, to help the oppressed people. Okay, it's just another version of patriotism, right? And of course, across the aisle over there, the Republicans are also selling it as patriotism. They're still in a Cold War vibe over there. We're going to stop socialism. We're going to stop the evils of communism. And liberate these people, And so the message is balanced just right to appeal to the core instincts that have been developed on both sides of the aisle. And so both sides of the aisle fully come along for the ride. And this keeps happening. And so now I'm going to switch over for a second and get us back to what was stated, what was written, what was stated as the founding principles of the United States about war, which was designed specifically to articulate how we were distinguishing ourselves from the European tradition of international warfare at that time, and why it was so critically important, and why it was arguably the very core principle of democracy itself, as opposed to monarchies and other forms of autocracies and nobility and aristocracy that were going on in the warlike European nation from which we were fighting a limited war to free ourselves from that and start a whole new approach to civilization. And so here is James Madison, co-author of the Constitution, near total author of the Bill of Rights, explaining what was the purpose of the constitutional approach to war in the United States. And so he said, after he was done being president, the following, and he, by the way, he wrote throughout his life on this concept, so it's a little bit redundant to other things that he and other founders and constitutional drafters and adopters were saying throughout their lives and left behind as the written record. And James Madison, of all the enemies of true liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes, and armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. In war, too, the discretionary power of the executive is extended. Its influence in dealing out offices, honors, and emoluments is multiplied, and all the means of seducing the minds are added to those of subduing the force of the people. The same malignant aspect in republicanism may be traced in the inequality of fortunes and the opportunities of fraud growing out of a state of war, and in the degeneracy of manner and morals engendered in both. No nation can preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. Those truths are well established. They are read in every page, which records the progression from a less arbitrary to a more arbitrary government, or the transition from a popular government to an aristocracy or a monarchy. It must be evident, then, that in the same degree as the friends of the propositions were jealous of armies and debts and prerogative, as dangerous to a republican constitution, they must have been averse to war as favorable to armies and debts and prerogative. And so that was James Madison, author of the Bill of Rights, co-author of the Constitution, President of the United States, articulating exactly what the founding of this country, what the American experiment was about at its core, and how it would be distinguished. And of course, the early American founders felt that they were safe from foreign wars of adventure because of the enormous distance, the same oceans that we still have today, the borders that we have today that rendered us generally safe, and that everyone felt that by far the greatest thing that a domestic population had to fear was a standing army under the power of a unitary executive that would be able to that would be expected to follow the commands of that unitary executive, and that the cost of raising that army would be borne by the ordinary people, and that the contracts would be spent. You heard him talking about the inequality of fortunes, right? The idea of military contracting was well established, by that era. War had been going on for a very long time, and everybody understood the inequality of fortune and how much of a public treasury it took to build, distribute weapons, to open up training grounds, to feed soldiers endlessly, train them, move them, transport them, build the instruments of transportation, and conduct the affairs of a large-scale standing army. And of course, we talk about income inequality in this country all the time and what it represents in terms of, inability to access the majority of our social contract, which is provided to us capitalistically on the basis of the ability to pay, as opposed to the army, which is foisted upon us socialistically through our taxes, and those fortunes then distributed through the private military contracting system to people who have, vast wealth and vast power over the conduct of our elections, because our elections are also privately financed through private donations. Our media is operated privately. The great thinking that goes into creating the scenarios by which people are convinced that war is in our interest and something that we want to sacrifice in order to finance and even our lives in order to conduct the think tanks, all floating on oceans and oceans of this unequally distributed funding that comes from this one source war. So we can see here in the United States that obviously this has happened. Madison, the rest of that document that I was reading from, he then went on to explain why that was the basis for the separation of powers over the military that's written into the Constitution, why it was written that way. We generally understand in school, that we learn about the separation of powers. The legislature can do this, the executive can do that, the judiciary can do that. But there are other separations of power throughout the Constitution about the specific functions, right? Budgets can only be initiated by the legislature, by the House of Representatives, in fact, not even the Senate. The president can sign that, but there's no budgetary authority under. It's part of the same thing, right? If the president were in charge of the budget, then that would be too much power, for an executive to have. Forget setting aside for a second the power of commanding a military. But all of this was written up to convince the people that would have to vote on the Constitution that the Constitution had sufficient safeguards over individual liberty, over an all-powerful executive, which we theoretically fought our war to separate ourselves from, and from unequal distribution of power and income from the ordinary productive capacity of the people. It almost sounds like we're talking to people who had a really strong sense of how a private economy can work in tandem with a small public economy to create a generally effective and peaceful general welfare in this country. Well, what do you know? Isn't that exactly what it said, that governments are instituted in order specifically to function? That the Declaration of Independence declared that when government ceases to serve those functions, that the people can deem that government to be in violation of the social contract and no longer in power, and legitimizes a revolution in that specific setting, the legal case being made for how a formerly legitimate government then can become identified as no longer legitimate, and therefore that a revolution to overthrow that government is not an illegitimate rebellion, but a legitimate one, because of the primary responsibility being to establish and operate an effective social contract, right, which is run with the consent of the governed, as we said in our founding documents, right? And that when the social contract is abrogated, then the people are at liberty to withdraw their consent. And a lot of this trying to restrict the potential for an all-powerful executive emerging when we had just freed ourselves from that is that we didn't want that to happen. You heard that in that last part of the quote I read from Madison, that it was all important to avoid the tendency for power to cause things to revert to a more autocratic system, that there was a sort of an entropy to it, and that we needed to have all these protections built into the Constitution to make sure that it wouldn't happen here. So Madison then went on to explain, for example, that the power to declare war, that a war would actually happen, would only be in the hands of the people, would be in the hands of Congress, and that the president's responsibility would be to conduct the war, that the president was the commander-in-chief. It says in the Constitution that it is exclusively the power of Congress to raise an army, although it will be under the direction of the commander-in-chief once it's raised. And that's not even when a war is being declared in general. These were considered essential, right? And as of the time of that interview with Göring in prison, it seems kind of, innocent now to look back that the interviewer was saying specifically, in the United States, only Congress can declare war. And interestingly, from the day that interview was conducted to the present day, we have had several dozen wars. We're having 7 right now, and not a single one of them was declared. We don't have and all these wars are initiated on the authority of the president. Exactly what wasn't supposed to happen, that the troop levels are set by the president, exactly what wasn't supposed to happen. Our great fortunes are distributed, no bid contracts, right? So whoever is the favorite of the awarding institution and the leadership in those processes, they make the big money. When they have cost overruns, it gets backfilled by the taxpayer. It's a no-risk operation. I mean, all of this is exactly what the United States was founded not to have happen. I am reading to you one of the authors of the Constitution, one of the authors of the Federalist Papers that was used to sell the Constitution to the state delegations that were going to approve it and the people that were going to advise their state delegations that they wanted this Constitution to be approved. And, if you're an originalist, if that's what you call yourself, then this is what you're supposed to be insisting that our government adhere to, right? And I've been out there among everybody, and just as Göring said, the ordinary people really don't want this. We find ourselves dragged into it all the time, but when you pin a person down individually and say, does this make any sense to you? Is this in your personal interest? The answer is always no. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows that the oil companies are getting rich. Everyone knows that the military contractors are getting rich. Everyone knows that they're making campaign contributions because it's on the Federal Election Commission's website. You can see what company every donor works for, what PACs are supported by which corporations, and the owners and the wealthy people that run those corporations. We know this, and yet even the people that insist that they consider themselves to be originalists. Here are the words of James Madison himself, the original originalist, explaining why it was set up that way. And here it is from 1945 to the present. It has never once operated that way. It's taking up 2/3 of our federal discretionary budget. We want our taxes to be cut. We want our civil liberties restored. We want our economy to function. And yet none of us are insisting that we go back to the original concept of safe and secure borders, a limited military, operating only in wars that were declared by Congress, by people who could be, put in office or replaced in office by the people in local districts based on their satisfaction with performance. All right, I've gone past the halfway point. Now we're past half an hour, and I'm going to pause again for a brief program ID. You are listening to the 9th episode of This Is Who We Are. My name is Steve Greenfield, and it is also the second hour and concluding hour from episode 8, which was about war and what is happening in the United States and the way that we function economically and governmentally that has led to us, really not only that this is happening, but that we are barely conscious of it, so barely conscious of it that it's not even part of our electoral process anymore. It's not 20 years, the longest wars by far, by many multiples of years of the longest wars in the history of the United States. And it's not even on the news. It's never on the news, And so we really need to understand the function of war and why it became possible and in the interest of our corporate power structure to make sure that it's operated this way and to make sure that it's never really visible to us in a day-to-day way. Like, they remember how the network coverage of the war in Vietnam was instrumental really in convincing the American people that this war wasn't really going anywhere. And of course, back then we also had network coverage of the Pentagon Papers, which was a study document inside the Pentagon establishment, in which it had been determined by as soon as 1967 that the United States would not be able to win a war in Vietnam, essentially a civil war, not a communist invasion, and that we needed to have some means to extract ourselves from it, and then basically for political reasons, as is still happening today in the 7 wars that we're fighting, we were not extricating ourselves from that war. The American mindset, the political mindset at that time, the American people believing that there's no such thing as a war that the United States doesn't win. And that brings us to another interesting thing about all these wars since the end, since we stopped declaring war, since we stopped having, these wars have had open objectives. They're never won. We've lost them. We certainly lost the Vietnam War. The Korean War, there's never been a peace settlement. That stopped. Eisenhower stopped that in 1953, and it's still technically a ceasefire. That war is still open, and has little flare-ups along the border. Certainly nobody in North or South Korea finds this to be in their interest, and that status there is largely a function of American policy as we continue to dominate that area and bring so much economic stimulus to them through the operation of American military bases on the Korean Peninsula and the trade deals that our corporate power structure has with the corporate structure and economy of South Korea, but not North Korea, right? So they go hungry, because that's the process of how we maintain this state of permanent hostility that leads the American people to believe that this massive top heavy over our entire economy and quality of life military operation is actually somehow in our own interest, and therefore sacrifices that we're willing to make. And so now I'm going to talk about those sacrifices that we're making. I mentioned last time that the term military-industrial complex was brought into the popular vocabulary of the United States by Dwight Eisenhower in his farewell address in January 1961, as he was about to leave office, in which he warned us, very clearly, in no uncertain terms, that as soon as the Cold War ended, that we would have to be extremely vigilant as a population to start dismantling the war machine, specifically for the reasons that Madison had articulated, right? That the war machine had become much too influential over research budgets, over acquisition of resources for manufacturing capacity, over the aggregation of money that could then be used to provide campaign finance and keep the whole thing going indefinitely. This is exactly what Eisenhower was articulating. It was a reworking in every sense of the word of the original reasoning that James Madison articulated in why our Constitution was drafted, to prevent that entropy, to prevent that tendency of wars that go on for too long. What Madison said, right? We could not maintain our liberty in long-term warfare, right? And so Eisenhower was basically reminding us of that same principle and how we were now in the midst of it, that it was happening in front of our eyes, and that we would have to stay on top of it so that as soon as the need for that kind of military manufacturing and troop levels, and it was set aside as a result of the ending, which he knew would come one day, of what was perceived as the existential threat of Soviet expansionism, and the threat to our allies in the post-World War II period, came to an end, that it would be up to us as a people to make sure that influence stopped and that spending stopped. We did not do that. The Soviet Union ended in 1991. They are now spending less than 1/20th what we spend. What's left of Russia now spending less than 1/20th of what we spend. They have no overseas military bases whatsoever, no capacity for international force projection whatsoever. And yet, interestingly enough, at this current juncture, the neo-McCarthyism, the new Russian hysteria, is in the hands of the Democrats, in the hands of the liberals. Not even in the hands of the conservatives, as it was, appearing, back at that time. And so Eisenhower's farewell address and other statements he made in the course of his presidency about the trade-offs that we were having, and you could think of it, right? It's anything that public spending would be spent on, right? Anything that you spend on a military project is something. You're not building a school, you're not building a road, you're not building a fire truck, you're not building a hospital, with whatever that equivalent amount of money that went to whatever military expenditure. That it went to. I remarked in the previous episode about how, a tank, except for the gun, if you take the gun off it, the gun turret, that a tank and a bulldozer is a pretty similar piece of machinery, right? It's a very large, heavy object that can move an enormous amount of weight, and it has two treads on either side of it and a giant engine capable of pushing enormous weight, right? So let's think, let's look at this in terms of the bulldozer versus the tank. Eisenhower, pulled his punch. He didn't really make it clear what was being given up in this guns and butter, trade-off, because, when you have a tank, the best you can hope for is that it's going to be idle and be completely unproductive. That you didn't make, 25 bulldozers as a result of that is only chapter one of the story of what you lost. Because that bulldozer is then going to, set up roads. It's going to be used to cut down fire lines when there's a wildfire. It's going to be used to grade earth for construction of schools and hospitals and anything, even private economic things, factories, whatever those bulldozers are going to get used for. If there's an excavator on the back, it's going to be used to dig trenches, to lay municipal water systems. And those things are going to continue to multiply and be productive for their entire working lifespans. So, for example, when you build a bulldozer instead of a tank, you're not just getting that thing of value in the work it does. You then get the value for the next 100 years or more of everything that went down that highway. Of everything, of every student for the next 100 years, the work of every student that came out of that school building. And then everything that followed from that, right? Everything that went down that road and everything that was built because of vehicles going down that road, and on and on and on. The loss is eternal. There's an ancient Jewish saying about the importance of saving a life, and that one who saves the life is as if they had saved the entire world, right? On that same kind of philosophy, that same recognition of that concept. You save one person, but then that person has children, and those children have children, and those forever and ever. And so what really is the extent of the sacrifice that we're making on this unproductive spending, setting aside the sheer destruction of it when it's operating. And we're going to get back to that in a minute, right? The destruction of surplus and why that matters in an economy like ours. We'll conclude with that and hopefully find a way to bring all this to an end with the common ground that we have common understanding about all this. But when you set aside a potential productive piece of production for something that's unproductive, you're not simply wasting that money. You are losing for as many generations into the future as that would cascade out, the entire productive capacity of what you didn't do, and all the entire productive capacities that everything that would have been done would then have led to, and on and on and on, literally until the end of time itself. That's what we're actually giving up. As articulate and moving as Eisenhower was in his regular speeches about the misdirection of funding into the military and his farewell address, he actually pulled his punches. It was nice that he did it, but it still didn't convey the full extent of what happens when we spend this money on guns instead of butter, when we spend this money on all this stuff, instead of food. Boy, imagine if instead of weapons of mass destruction, we were using this money to remediate the environmental harm that we've caused. Instead of spending $11 trillion on a new generation of nuclear weapons, this was authorized by Barack Obama. I have to constantly emphasize how bipartisan this particular, devastation that's being wreaked upon the United States and the world, just how bipartisan it is. That, $11 trillion, man, there's your whole Green New Deal. There's the end of fossil fuel pollution. There's the end of fossil fuel wars, of wars in the Middle East. There's the end of global warming. There is, the ability to produce energy in a sustainable way indefinitely into the future, just on the one project. And throw in the failed F-35, that they're now looking to replace, that never fulfilled a mission in all the years that 1.7 trillion. Boy, the advanced, tech that has been blown on that, the jet engine power, the efficiencies of mechanics and everything else that went into that, the materials that went into that. $11 trillion currently being spent on redeveloping the entire global nuclear weapons force of the United States. The most terrifying of all forms of weaponry, because this is one that we know that why would anybody manufacture a weapon beyond its ability to destroy all human life on Earth once? Why do we have many multiples? Why, since the 1950s, have we had many multiples of the capacity to wipe out the entire human population of the Earth? You can only do it once, okay? This has got to be the clearest illustration of everything that's wrong and how self-deluded we have become because of what we're told by our leaders, as Göring articulated, about the need for this. Something as fundamental as recognizing that we can only destroy the human population of the world a single time has not stood in the way of us not rebelling against $11 trillion of developing nuclear weapons that we've had since the 1950s that can destroy the entire global human population, 10, 20 times over. Just from our own personal contribution, let alone that might come in from any enemies that are trying to survive this kind of attack. Of course, that kind of attack is not survivable. And so that's it. That's the clearest possible articulation. There has to be some other reason besides a military function that we've developed enough power to destroy all human life more than one time. It obviously is not about national security. It is not about protecting the world from a Soviet takeover. It's not about any of those things, because we can only protect the world from all of that in a suicidal way one single time. And yet we went overboard and created the capacity to do it many multiples of that. And so here we're going to pause once again at the 3/4 mark for a program ID. This is episode 9 of This Is Who We Are, a new online public affairs broadcasting program. My name is Steve Greenfield. I am your host. And so let's continue now. I think we've pretty firmly established why this was never supposed to be the American creed, what exactly it has done, what it does to the global dynamic, and that final element that I just described. How could this spending and production of war material still be going on when it has exceeded the capacity to wipe out the entire human population of the world more than the one single time that is the maximum that you could do that, if that were your goal, as bizarre a goal as that could be? Personally, whatever it is that I'm supposed to be saved from, I'm not saved from it if I'm dead. So that's something else to consider. But again, the sheer illogic of it all. So let's return now to this element of the destruction of surplus, what that's all about, why the masters of war do that, and why war is the most expedient way to do it. And then when we have, gotten an understanding of that, I'm going to wrap the session up with a brief talk about why the draft is not the answer. That keeps coming up. That is particularly among Democrats in our society, this strange belief that the draft would somehow prevent us from going to war. Surely an illogical concept, in that it is, our ability to wage war is the only limit on whether or not we will wage war. We certainly didn't skip any wars when we had the draft. We have skipped several, now that we don't, and limited the way that we operate in some of the ones that we had by that. So we'll conclude with just touching on the draft and why that's not the answer. Okay, so destruction of surplus, right? As I said last time, we have $20 trillion divided by the size of the population. A family of 4 in the United States would have $260,000 a year. This is way more than any of us need to survive, and 4 or 5 times the amount that more than half of us survive on, and actually live pretty calm. 60 grand, You can live decently on 60 grand. You can own a house, a freestanding house on 60 grand. Not a big one, but you could own one. You could afford private health insurance on 60 grand. 60 grand and yet if we were dividing the entire production of this country on an annual basis, that number would be $260,000 a year. We'd all be damn rich. We wouldn't even know how to spend that much money. Every 4 years, we'd be a millionaire. All of us, all of our families. And so obviously that's not the case. And so what we have here is that if this surplus were in some way equitably distributed among the population, then it would be possible for more and more people to gain equity. And when you gain equity, when you gain property, when you can buy stocks in corporations, this other form of democracy that only a very limited number of us can participate with because your vote is by how much stock you own in that particular, in the private markets. That's what nobody wants to happen. Nobody wants us buying stock. Nobody wants us becoming vested. Then the small number of people that are in control, the plutocracy, the oligarchy, the aristocracy, whatever you'd like to call them, they potentially start losing control over the private sector and over campaign finance and by extension, the public sector, right? And so a great deal of this wealth has to be destroyed every year in ways that keeps the money and the manufacturing capacity in the hands of this tiny few people in this country, the people that own and operate Raytheon, the people that, we have to have people going bankrupt on out-of-pocket costs of healthcare because if they weren't, they'd be buying stock. They'd be donating to campaigns. They'd be doing all kinds of things to raise their own equity level and leave it to their own children where it will continue to grow generation after generation. And the most powerful people would not have a guarantee that they and their heirs would continue to be the most powerful people. Same thing. We're not going to remediate the environment. We're not going to stop extracting and combusting fossil fuels. This is just simply not going to happen. Global warming is actually good for these people because then they can set themselves up as caretakers. They can get the big contracts to build the seawalls and the flood control devices and the giant carbon reducing machines, that people are talking about now that'll reduce carbon and sequester it deep inside the ground. The geoengineering of putting little reflective particles to reflect sunlight back, right? They will get those contracts. They will maintain their power and control, the centralization of ownership, of our right to have a job that none of us can start up our own startup companies because we don't have investment capital. We continue to need to accept work on the terms that they offer it to us, at the wages they offer it to us, at the access to health care that they offer to us, because they are in control of the entirety of the productive economy, and through the way that we finance our elections, the way that we operate our media. It is one giant holistic system that operates in coordination with itself to just continue concentrating wealth and power in the hands of the people who already have the most of it, because they have the ability to do that. The exact thing that James Madison warned us happens when there's continual warfare and standing armies. That exact thing that we were warned about, the inequality of the distribution of fortunes and the power that creates, and how it is not undoable once it's in place. That's where we are. And we do not have the option in this country of voting for a party that recognizes that. Because the two major political institutions that determine whether or not a candidacy is viable, as we're taught through our media and conditioned to believe through our media, even though our vote is free, are the two war parties. Okay, and so it doesn't matter whether you elect Democrats or Republicans. In order to satisfy their respective core constituencies, they distribute the crumbs of what they're doing in different ways that make you feel like at least you got something a little bit less evil from the one that you were supporting. But it's always crumbs, and it's always going to be crumbs, because wages are not going to go up. The controllers of the private economy control the political sector, and our wages are not going to rise. Our environment is not going to be remediated. We are not going to have rising equity. There is not going to be reparations. There is not going to be health care. None of this is ever going to happen because 2/3 of the federal discretionary budget is going to the military specifically to maintain this imbalance of power and to destroy the surpluses so that they can't be diverted by a popular uprising to other purposes that would allow the rest of us to live better. That surplus has to be destroyed, and there's only one destructive thing in the world, which is war. Only war is destructive, and that is why substantial oligarchies, as Göring was articulating and as Madison was warning us about at the founding of this country, it is the powerful that need those surpluses destroyed, because otherwise they could end up having to distribute them to the rest of us, and that would be an intolerable condition. Okay, getting near the end, and I'm going to wrap up with the talk that keeps cropping up about the draft. No, the draft will not do it. The draft means that the manpower will always be available in unlimited numbers because people will not have the right to say, no, I won't go. And there are people who sort of look back at the Vietnam War era, the last time we had a peace movement in this country, and say, see, that's why. And if parents had skin in the game, they'd stop wars from happening. No, it wasn't about the parents back then. It was about the kids. It was about the 18 to 21-year-olds themselves. And it was largely because a great number of them were able to use the exemptions to the draft, educational exemptions, all kinds of exemptions that were written into the draft that got people out of it. And then those people that weren't being drafted were the principal population and theorists and strategists of the anti-war movement of that era. And they were also substantially like actual leftists, socialists at that time, which we also no longer have. We no longer have a powerful anti-establishment youth operating in that way, and in that sense of stopping colonialism, that classic left-wing motive. But the bigger picture is that all of those exemptions have long since been ended. Some of them through court action, legislative action. They were properly found to be racially discriminatory. They all were. And so they no longer exist. Nobody's going to have exemptions anymore. There isn't going to be a college exemption. You're not going to be able to go to college. You're going to be drafted into the Army, with college maybe as an afterthought. The system that we have right now is really no better. People call it the economic draft because that's what it is. That's part of what the ruling class is doing in this country. That's why they're keeping 50 million people in poverty, because the only way to get a college scholarship for those people is going to be to join the Army. And if you manage to survive and come back home again, mostly in one piece, you can get some financial aid to go to college. It's the only source of social mobility. These other countries that don't spend what we do, they have social mobility. We have, along with this massive military budget, and it's no coincidence, it's causal, we have the lowest rate of social mobility in the entire industrialized world. However you're born, whatever economic condition you're in, you're overwhelmingly likely to die in that same status. Within the overall economic structure. That's the price we pay, and that's why it's operated, right? Without poverty, nobody would be volunteering for the Army. Nobody would be volunteering to commit these acts of destruction on behalf of the ruling plutocrats and oligarchs that need to have all that destruction of surplus rendered on their behalf and their continued power. So without and if we had the draft, then what would we have? We would have the rending apart of families of 18-year-olds leaving home, everything under the sun, people getting killed, people never getting a chance in life because they're being sent out to die for oil and for destruction of surpluses and for the maintenance of the power structure, and not for anything, as Göring said, what's the best you could hope for is to try to come home in one piece and go back to your farm, no matter what the system of induction is. And so what really needs to be done is we have to stop the wars, and we have to slash the military budget, and if we have to vote for minor party candidates and stop voting for the two major parties to make that happen, that's what we're going to have to do. And so that's why, of course, the two parties also have their respective election suppressing mechanisms. The Democrats deny access to third parties. The Republicans deny minorities the right to vote altogether. It's all designed to serve the same function as works on their respective sides of the aisle to their respective constituencies. It's all Nader's fault. No, Nader would have stopped this. It wasn't Nader's fault, okay? It was Gore's fault. It was the Democrats' fault. It was Bush's fault. It was the Republicans' fault. So we have to break out of this mindset that they keep us under this kind of control, and we have to do what is necessary, because if we don't stop war, if we don't bring our military budget down to maybe what China is spending, even though they have, many, 5-6 times the population we have, bring it down to that level where it's defensive within defensible borders and not serving this corporate power purpose, we're never going to have what we need. We're never going to have what we need to survive. All of this environmental deterioration, social deterioration, health deterioration is just going to keep getting worse and worse and worse, and we'll never extricate ourselves from it. So I urge you now, as I'm concluding this episode, please, take one for the team. Let an election go. Tell these people that they don't have your vote unless they're slashing the military budget. And now you know the terminology you can use, and the tactics, and speak to people about this and finally bring this to a halt. Because without it, the United States, we are teetering right now. We are bankrupt. We're not providing health care. What happened to the Soviet Union in 1991 is happening to us right now in real time in front of our eyes. And we're staring at it like deer into the headlights, watching it happen. And we're getting hit. 500,000 of us got hit just in the last 12 months. And those cars they're going to keep on coming. So people, please, I implore you, share this with your friends, both episodes about war, and let's just do whatever it takes, literally whatever it takes, by any means necessary. Make the war machine come to an end. It's Hermann Göring's war machine, and it's the war machine that James Madison warned us about. Let's work together and make it stop. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time.